Welcome to Satisfied, a monthly program on the Generation podcast designed to offer practical tools based on biblical principles so that anyone can experience full purity and lead others to do the same. Hello, and thanks for joining us again here on the Satisfied podcast, a part of the Generation Network. We are excited that you've chosen to tune in again as we continue in this series on perverted passions, or really a series that's been on homosexuality. We've explored several different angles of this already, but last week really began a discussion that's at the heart of the issue of homosexuality, and that is dealing with the question of, was I born this way? And so this is going to be a part 2 of that discussion. Doing a quick recap on what we discussed last week, we really answered the question, was I born this way? First off, last week was addressing it with no, you weren't. And it's specifically addressing the cases in which somebody may be wondering or feeling even a certain way, like they may be attracted to the same gender or wondering that way, but they, in this case at least, were not born that way. And so we really focused on when Romans 1 says they became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And then it goes on to say that they became enthralled and involved with passions that were not natural, and men lying with men and women with women. So the point of that passage, and how it interestingly correlates to 2 Corinthians 10:5, is our responsibility to cast down those vain imaginations. And that was the action step that we took from that podcast last month. And I think this is the solution or the prevention for many, many, many people that are heading this direction in homosexuality. It's just beginning in the mind. We live in a sexualized culture, a perverted culture even more, and it's so important to guard what you allow yourself to consider. And it really boiled down to, at the end of that last podcast, was just keep in mind what you know to be true. You know how God creates and how he doesn't create, and the type of desires that he does give and the type of sexual desires he does not give. You know that from Scripture. So let's start there. And when you start there, that is what is true. And you have no obligation to consider something that cannot be true. That's just such a freeing thing. And like last week, just felt like shouting that from the rooftops, from people that spend too much time wondering because of a certain personality they have or certain hobbies that they have, and they wonder, how come I enjoy things my other guy friends don't enjoy, and or if you're a girl, my interests don't line up with the average girl, and so your mind starts doing some really weird things, and we've got a very simple term for that. It's vain imaginations. So flee from those things, cast them down, and you have no obligation to consider something that cannot be true. It's very freeing. Smile and wave. No way. Not putting an ounce of thought into something that cannot be true. So I think for many that could be the answer, and helpful or preventative in freeing. But what about those that do feel like, to the best that they can understand, they can't really see it any other way than that they were born this way? This wasn't something that was a result of environmental reasons. It wasn't that they were abused or had a poor relationship with their mother or father, or different things that in some cases can set a person going that direction. But maybe in your case, or someone that you know, it seems like there's no other explanation than that they were just born this way. Now, that used to be a scary thing for me to say, although I think many of us had a very difficult time dealing with people that would say that of themselves. I can argue all I want and say, no, you weren't, but they're the ones that have lived their life and look back. And if they could find a way out of these passions and choose another way, they would. But they cannot think of a distinct and clear choice where they decided to go down that way. And best they can tell, this disposition, as it were, started as early as they can remember. So, what if they were born that way? Is that possible? Well, what I used to say is that, well, maybe they were born that way, but they weren't created that way. And this is what I mean by that. Maybe it's possible, like different ones are born with different propensities to sin. Then maybe, sure, there's some people that are born with a propensity towards homosexual desires, and that's the sin they're going to fight. Like, I have sins that I'm going to fight, and you have sins you're going to fight. And so that's their propensity, that's their fallen nature. It's not something God intended, but it's a result of the fall. And so why should we be surprised if they're fighting a sin like we're fighting a sin, though it may be different? And I think there may be some truth to that. And, I still think that could work and answer some questions, and potentially is the case for some people. I do like the fact that we're not glorifying our own sin as somehow better than a homosexual and his sin. In fact, we spent a podcast focusing on how God views sin in the New Testament, and that we fail to see a real hierarchy here of the levels of severity of our sin in the New Testament. So that much is consistent. I do feel like, though, what I kept coming back to, and I can't remember if I mentioned this in an earlier podcast, but I kept coming back to wanting to get past it, to be honest, but the difference between corruption and perversion. So where if somebody struggles with a heterosexual sin, they're taking a God-given aspect of sexuality, God-given heterosexuality, and they are corrupting it. It's a corruption of a God-given desire. They're misusing it, in other words. However, with homosexuality, it's not a God-given desire at all. It's a perversion of a God-given desire, I guess you could say. And I think that's why in the Old Testament it's treated with a greater severity, and being against the very created order of God and his nature and image as well. And so I think that's why. It's just because it's a perversion, not a corruption. It's a bit different, and I think he viewed it a bit differently. So that would be my only hesitation, I think, with saying you've got your sin, I've got my sin, and just like you're born with a propensity towards your sin, I'm born with a propensity towards this sin. I'm not sure that could be possible with a perversion of a God-given desire like that, as opposed to just a misuse of something God has given. I don't know, but I think the reason I'm not as ascribed to that position anymore is because I'm much more excited about another verse that to me has been very, very helpful in understanding this. And I'll admit right now, I am partway through this study, have been reading multiple books on this, finished several, in the middle of one right now that's been really good. And it may be why we do a third part is actually very likely on this question of was I born this way? Because there's just so much to it, and I'm still working through this, but I'm very excited with what I have come across here. That is not new teaching. This is the crazy thing. Historically, this has actually been a position held for quite some time. In fact, there were early Christian works from the 2nd century that are taking this position and explaining the passage we'll be looking at in the same way that we'll be presenting it today. So here it is. This is going to be kind of crazy. Some of you are going to be scratching your heads when you hear where we're going with this. Or maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's not new to you. Maybe I'm the one that has not heard it put this way before. But we're in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 12. And I'll say right away, there are people that have tried to use this passage in regards to homosexuality in a wrong way. And so I think actually Christians have been a bit turned off to finding some teaching about homosexuality or some help from the issue of homosexuality from this passage is because it's been misused. But we'll address that. Let's not be scared of it. Let's read it for what it's worth here. Matthew 19, verse 12. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Now, in context, this is a discussion on marriage and divorce. And Jesus' response here in verse 12, he's responding to after he has taught that marriage is between a man and a woman for life, a lifelong covenant, and there's no easy way out with divorce. Then the disciples are taken aback and say, well, maybe it's better if we don't marry. And Jesus is saying in verse 12, well, that path does exist, but it's not for the faint of heart, and it's not for the reasons that you're currently thinking. And so he's explaining what would be an ancient time known as a eunuch, someone who was unable or unwilling to participate in marriage and or sexual activity. Now let's walk through each of these because Jesus gives 3 different examples of how someone could be classified or how they could become a eunuch. So let's actually start with the second one, which is, I think, generally what is thought of when people think of eunuchs, and historically this is how many of them were. And this is those which were made eunuchs of men, Jesus said. This obviously is something not comfortable to talk about, but it was through the physical manipulation, the castration of men, many times young men, for a very specific purpose. Historically, many times this was when a king wanted devoted, undistracted, and even pure men around him to focus on serving him rather than flirting with the palace women and make sure there was no funny business going on. And so he would make sure that those around him were not able to have such a relationship. And so those closest to the king were in that condition at his order. But when we put it that way, initially we think, at least looking from our culture into another culture and time period, it seems like a cruel punishment. And it certainly was cruel, but it was not intended to be a punishment. Best I can tell, the eunuchs were actually pretty highly regarded. They were seen as a dangerous part. If you were going to, for example, I read this, if you were going to try to overthrow another kingdom, one of the first group of individuals you would want to take out was the king's eunuchs, those closest to the king. They were so effective and powerful because they were not distracted by the things that many of us are distracted by. And without that to slow them down, they were an extremely powerful and effective part of the kingdom. Not trying to justify anything here, just telling you historically what a eunuch was, which we'll find out is a little interesting and how it correlates in a bit. So those obviously would be what Jesus is referring to as those that have been made eunuchs of men. But the next one we read of is those which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Now, this is not physical manipulation of any kind here. This is a choice of celibacy. And I think it even goes beyond that. But this would be a decision, and presumably for the same reason, that someone is choosing to refrain from marriage or sexual relationships for the kingdom of heaven's sake. That's what Jesus says. Now, for some listening to this may be less a choice of celibacy and more a choice of chastity, remaining single or intentionally pure, maybe temporarily for the time being or indefinitely, but it's for a specific purpose. This, I believe, is even where the gift of singleness that Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians, where this comes into play. Now, Bobby Bosler and I have been kind of comparing notes back and forth on this because he just happens to be doing a study through 1 Corinthians right now with his church, and very expositionally, as you would expect from Bobby Bosler, digging deep into the Greek language in this. And I'm going to defer to his study on that passage, that he really feels like the Greek word being used there for the gift of singleness, it's the root is charis, so it's a grace gift, and something that would be intended for believers in that case would be my understanding based off of the study that he's done. So I'm not saying that the grace gift there is given at birth to someone, and that's what we see here as the gift of singleness. I don't think that's what it is. But to somebody that, in this case, Jesus is saying some quote-unquote eunuchs, they're in the position of singleness, just like someone born that way, but they weren't. They've chosen this. Why have they chosen this? Well, it's at least for a time of singleness, maybe celibacy, at least chastity. But for anyone that's going to do that effectively, and this is any listener to this podcast that is single, anyone who's going to do that effectively, you know what you need? You need grace. You need grace. I don't care if it's going to be for another 2 months for you before your wedding, or if it's going to be for another 20 years. You need grace. And I just think that's a pretty neat thing to know, that there's grace available for you. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what Paul is referring to with the gift of singleness there, but it is grace gifted to singles for a very specific purpose of refraining and keeping yourself, for one, and being pure, and for the purpose. And this is the key. This isn't just for abstinence sake. As with all the other case of intentional singleness here in this verse called eunuchs, it's for a very specific purpose of service. And whether for you that's, again, for 2 more months, or whether it's 20 years or indefinitely, maybe the rest of your life of singleness, should not we all be willing, if God called us to such a task, be willing and honored to choose to accept that at this point, wherever you're at right now? I'm willing, if you should lead me, to surrender this area of marriage, though it is God's plan for most, and we shouldn't get away from that. But if now is not the time, then you're going to need to access some grace and get serious and intentional about what God has for you right now. It's time to be an intentional servant, a devoted, dedicated, undistracted servant of the King. So that would describe those that are eunuchs of their own accord. They have chosen this. So we have those that were made eunuchs. That's historic, that's ancient, and cruel manipulation. Then we have those that have chosen to be single in indefinite celibacy or an intentional period of chastity. But what about those that Jesus says are born eunuchs from their mother's womb, are born eunuchs? Well, born single. Weren't we all born single? Well, it's obviously more than that. So if it's more than being born single, what is this? I don't think it's that they were born looking any different than the rest of us. This is something on the inside, born without the distractions that many of us would face because of sexuality. There are some that have been designed that way from birth. Well, what in the world would that look like? Someone born without sexual desires. Have you ever known someone to say that they were born without sexual desire? And obviously this referring to after the time of puberty, nothing's happening. Nothing's clicking, whether that's 11 or 13 or 16 or whenever. Things aren't happening like they're quote unquote supposed to. And like maybe as a man, he's recognizing his friends around him, teenage friends, um, all seem to be running off with girls and probably doing things they shouldn't be, but why isn't he feeling the same attraction to women that his friends have and are talking about, or his brothers? Let me ask you, have you ever known someone that was born without sexual desire? Now, we have all kinds of sexual orientations today. I'm not even going to try to get through them. And there would be people that would identify as, I guess it would be non-binary, like not having a gender or something like that. But for someone to say, I do not participate at all, I'm not attracted at all, that's not a very popular thing. Have you noticed? It just struck me as, why is there no one like this today? Why don't we see people being born eunuchs with no sexual desire, if that's what this is? Well, then it hit me. Wait a second. This actually does sound familiar. I've asked people over and over and over who are coming with looking for help with homosexuality, perverted desires, where did this first start for you? Because I'm trying to figure out what that first trigger is. And overwhelmingly, what I've been told is not that, well, I was such and such a single digit age old when I realized an attraction towards the same gender. I'm not saying that never happened. I'm just saying overwhelmingly what more often happens is someone saying, as early as I can remember, I thought it was odd. I thought it was weird because I didn't like the same things that my friends liked. I wasn't attracted to women like they were. I wasn't wanting to hang out with the girls or view them the same way that they did. Or the same could be said for you ladies. Growing up, there was no sexual attraction at all to the opposite gender. Why is that? Well, here's what often happens, and this is tragic. When someone notices a lack of heterosexual desire, then they begin to explore the alternative, because there's only one other alternative, right? Well, if you're not heterosexual, you must be homosexual. So is that the only other alternative? And we really are convinced it is, even in our churches. And that's why we get so scared if somebody says, man, I'm really not attracted to the opposite gender. And we're terrified because we think, no, they're going to end up gay. They're going to end up homosexual. No. You got to, God will give you that desire back. We got to make this happen somehow. He's going to give you a desire for the opposite gender. Well, what if he doesn't? What now? You see, when we present this as the only alternative, then we've given them no choice. I'm talking about the young people in our churches. We have given them no choice than to explore, to see what is this alternative. I guarantee you they don't want it. They would so much rather be normal in this area. But we have so associated the lack of heterosexual desires with homosexual desires that it's like it is a terrible sin if you are not attracted to the opposite gender. And if someday you're going to know God's got a hold of your life and you are right where you're supposed to be because you're going to be married in a heterosexual relationship with 4 kids. Now, I understand why we would assume that of someone, and to us that does seem like the just epitome of a beautiful story of deliverance. And God has done that. But from what I've studied on this, do you know what also happens many, many times? Is that a young Christian individual, because he's been told victory looks like a heterosexual marriage for him, he really forces it, gets into a relationship, gets married with someone he still is not attracted to in that way, tries to make it work, and it ends up a disaster. Because he's trying to live out the vision that we've created for him. And just maybe, it's not what God designed him for. I read the story of a boy who grew up in a Christian family. And just like all the situations I told you of, this boy grew up recognizing that he was not attracted to the opposite gender. So eventually he tested it. I think he was 16 years old. took a girl on a date. And just to see, and I'm not recommending this, not condoning this, but he was so desperate to see if this was true, if there was any desire for her at all. And although he appreciated her as a friend, he did not feel any draw towards her at all, like what resembled what his friends were talking about. And he really had no desire to continue the relationship. It was just odd. Great girl, everyone else wanted to be with her, but it just didn't do anything for him. He, at this point, 16 years old, had no desires towards the opposite gender or the same gender, but was in a very vulnerable position. Why? Because nobody understands what he's going through. No one in his church, no one in his family, and understandably so, can relate to or understand or tell him what's going on inside of him. So then finally, when he goes to college and someone approaches him, a man approaches him, a young man, and says, you seem not quite like a lot of the other guys here and your desires and who you're wanting to hang around. And he says, I want to tell you something. I think I know what's up. I think I understand you. I know exactly what you're going through. I've been there. Several of us have been there, have gone through that. We understand you. We care for you. And we want you. And as disgusting as that is, alluring someone into homosexuality that way, a very innocent and vulnerable individual can so easily be sucked in that way. Because why? He finally is speaking to someone who understands, or at least that they claim to be able to understand. He feels understood. He feels listened to. And though I'm sure everything in him hates the reality of it, it's like there's no denying. This must be the only alternative. And so in the story I'm reading, this young man then falls into it eventually, quote unquote, comes out of the closet, announces to his family, most of whom separate from him, want nothing to do with him. A couple of them, his mother and his grandma, really get desperate praying for this young man. Clearly in answer to those prayers, the pastor of the grandma reads this verse in Matthew 19. Begins studying this out. And then when he's introduced to this young man, wonders if this is the case for him. If this young man could have been chosen by God to be a eunuch, to be single, and in turn God did not give him sexual desires. But because the church is so misinformed in this area and saw victory as having to push this individual into heterosexuality, which God did not call him to, then this young man missed out on the opportunity he had to live in line with his intended purpose. This pastor sat down with this individual, now a college student, and walked him through this passage. This college student who had come out and said he's gay. He's a gay Christian. Just accept it how it is. And now this pastor is walking him through the passage. And he explains the very specific purpose and calling that this young man was designed for. To be a devoted, dedicated, undistracted servant of the King. Things began to make sense. This young man realized that the only reason he was with men was because he thought it was the only alternative. But it was empty. And he begins weeping and looks up at his mom and says, "Mom, I'm not gay. God's made me a eunuch." And that's where the deliverance began for this young man. Now, I know that's crazy to use a word like that we really have, we have not spent any amount of time talking about. And it's not a comfortable word to use. And maybe we find a different one. But here's the point. Jesus describes individuals that God has created without sexual desires. But contrary to how some homosexual Christians have tried to read this verse, and this is what I was referring to earlier as how some have tried to use this and twist it to condone homosexuality. That is not at all what God is dealing with. He's not God is not creating a perverted desire. What he's created is an absence from desire. It is an absence from sexual attraction. And there are those in our churches. How many? I have no idea. But there are those that have been created for a very specific purpose. And honestly, though not an easy purpose and certainly not an easy life, it is an extremely high calling. The ones most valued in the kingdom, the ones seen as the greatest danger and the most powerful, the ones seen as the biggest threat to other kingdoms, the ones seen as the most powerful were those standing closest around the king, who was the king's eunuchs. Friends, that is the alternative. I'm just saying, if that is you, a man or woman, and we'll get to that later in another podcast, we'll address that aspect. But if that's you, I am so sorry that you didn't have someone there to say, hey, I can only imagine exactly how you feel. It must be so difficult and confusing, but don't worry. There is nothing wrong with you. You have been chosen by God. As some chose to be single, as some were told have chosen to be eunuchs for a very specific purpose, why is it so hard to understand that God has chosen you for the same purpose from birth? Maybe it's for a season, maybe it's more, maybe it's indefinitely, maybe it's for your life, but God has chosen you for a specific purpose and specially designed you to serve your King. You are an indispensable part of God's kingdom. God wants to be surrounded with people just like you. And I wish you had someone to tell you that earlier. I wish you did, because I'm thinking of friends of mine that are in this position. And I ache for them. They're really the reason that I'm even studying this out at all. I ache for you, men and women, and wish that you had somebody to tell you this sooner. But you are neither an accident or an oversight, but an intentionally designed special forces servant for your King. Now you say, but that was years ago when I passed that. These desires now for the same gender are real and rampant. Maybe they seem real. And that, my friends, is sadly what often happens. Someone begins in the point of no sexual desire, but when someone comes along and they can relate, by the way, this is in the latest book I was reading on this, was relating it to like trying to live in a completely different culture. That's how these people feel when they have no sexual desire. It's like living in a foreign country and trying to find someone they can relate to. There was a time in, I think it was 2018, I was in Dubai, and only there for, I think, about 24 hours or so. It wasn't very long, but it was just enough time to get out of the airport and to see the city a bit, the Burj Khalifa and different things. The Dubai Mall is incredible. Well, I was in the Dubai Mall, walking around there, and I'm telling you, I felt so out of place. Never in my life have I felt so out of place. Not just language barrier, but culture, religion. I mean, I was warned by so many people, do not give out tracts in Dubai. It's like a death sentence. Nevertheless, I had some tracts with me, and I thought, well, if the right occasion comes, then it'd be really cool to give out tracts here for that reason, I guess. And there was an opportunity that came up with a individual, clearly not from Dubai. He was African, but he asked me to take his picture of he and his wife. And so they're in the Dubai Mall taking their picture. Well, clearly they were tourists. They weren't from Dubai either. So I thought, well, maybe this is a safe bet to give them a tract. So I whipped out a tract and gave it to them, and they spoke good English. And he looks over the tract and he says, "Man, this is a good one." Well, it turns out he's a born again believer from Nigeria, and he and his wife were there on I want to say it was like a 5-year anniversary. And I cannot explain the relief of the camaraderie that we had at that point. Being on the same page, someone that spoke my language in more than one way. I took him out to eat, and I was just there by myself. So we just had an incredible time together. Just a wonderful couple and just an amazing Christian brother. We left that time and we've kept in touch since. He ended up naming his son Ryan because of that correspondence, and also he just really wanted his son to be a preacher himself, and so he surprised me with that news later on, and just the sweetest couple and family. But I'm telling you all that to say, since then, there has been this really special place in my heart for Nigerians. And you don't meet them all the time, but they're certainly around. And it wasn't long after that that I started to be able to recognize other Nigerians. And I'd be walking through, and at one point it was in an airport. It was airport security, and I passed a guy. He said probably just two words, and I turned to him and I said, "Are you Nigerian?" And he was shocked, and he said yes, I am. And so we had a good brief conversation there, and that was neat. Then at my church in Wisconsin, there was a guy. I think he was moving a piano into the church or something like that. Somebody from the community or a business or something. I don't remember exactly, but again, heard him talk and turned to him. Are you Nigerian? Yeah, sure enough. And then at another time, it was in another airport. It was a customs guy. It wasn't even the one I was talking to, but he was interviewing someone at a booth down from me in customs getting back into the country. And I heard his accent. As soon as I got done with my guy, I walked over. Are you Nigerian? Yeah, sure enough. And I just love speaking to Nigerians. Now, why? Well, clearly because of that camaraderie that I felt at a very difficult and vulnerable moment when I finally felt understood by one person in all of Dubai and his wife, and were able to have a meaningful relationship there in Dubai. It is a powerful thing, and it does something to you to be understood in a vulnerable moment. And that doesn't soon leave you. But in spite of my affinity and love for Nigerian people, not one time have I thought, well, maybe that God called me to them, or maybe I am Nigerian. After all, had no idea all this time. My parents didn't tell me. Where is this desire coming from? I know where it came from. I was understood and could relate to a Nigerian in a very vulnerable time. And it had a special, special time and a special friendship in that moment. And I just use that to illustrate, as this author was saying, that for those without sexual desire, they're obviously extremely vulnerable, and they can't find anyone to relate to. It's like walking in a foreign country, and the first person that comes along that can relate, there is a very deep bond in relationship. And so if you're telling me and saying, yeah, okay, well, maybe early on I didn't feel that, but yeah, definitely sensing homosexual desires right now. There's no lack of that desire. I think what you're sensing is that very thing. You were related to at a vulnerable moment. That wasn't God-given desire. And it can't even be truly fulfilling. It can't be. It isn't. Because that's not what God designed you for. There is something so much better. Maybe those desires seem real and rampant right now, but they are based on a false identity. They're based on a false premise that God made a mistake with you, that you had no purpose, that you'd be missing out not to indulge with others who claim to understand and want you. But now that you understand that you have been called and designed for a very specific and special purpose, now you try to live that same empty life, knowing what you now know. That God didn't make a mistake. Instead, He chose to make you specially for Him with an incredible purpose to be closest to the King. And how much will you be missing out if you do not turn back to the one that chose you and that wants you and that actually loves you for who you are, because that's the way He made you. Wow. Friends, it's time to be a servant, a devoted, dedicated, undistracted servant of the King, like God called you to be. There's so much more, I think, in this discussion as I continue to look into this, and I hope you're as excited as I am. But I'm telling you, more than ever, I know I say this a lot, but as we conclude here, this is very, very important to me, that if you can relate with what I've just said, that please reach out and let me know. This is so important. I've got to know if this is relating to something, and you can sense, yes, this is what God designed me this way. And maybe it's indefinite. Maybe it's something for a specific time and purpose. I don't know. You may not know. But what you will know is that there's something different about how God made me. And that doesn't make me a liability. That makes me an asset to the kingdom. And I want to rise to what I'm called for right now. I want to put in however much time I'm called to serve at the King's side. He chose me, and I'm down. I'm down. If that's you, well then, first of all, get before the King and accept your calling. He's waiting for you, and he needs you. But then I would appreciate it, and I think our listeners would be helped if you would let us know how you relate to this. Or if in your case you say, it's different for me. That's not it. Maybe that's for some people. It's not for me. That's just as helpful for me. If you would let me know that. I'm telling you, I really need to hear that either this is your life we're speaking of, or someone you know, and you can say, I think this lines up. This is what God's doing in their life, or not. Let me know, please. That's going to be so helpful. We'll keep all contacts will be anonymous. So please don't worry about that. But I want to know how many special servants of the King we have in our midst. Ryan@satisfied.org is my email, and I'd love to hear from you in these coming days. Well, we'll continue this discussion further next month, and I look forward to what else the Lord has for us from this and other passages as well, as we continue our journey to be less gratified and more satisfied with Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Generation Podcast. If you've been blessed or helped in any way by this episode or any other episodes, please consider sharing what God has done in your life. Your testimony could be exactly what someone else needs to take their own step out of the boat. To share your testimony, please visit thegeneration.org/testimony.